Welcome to this journey through one of the most deliberately concealed cases in Salem's history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1894, Salem, Massachusetts, was a city desperately trying to escape the shadow of its infamous witch trials 2 centuries earlier. The textile mills hummed with prosperity, Victorian mansions lined the streets, and respectable citizens attended church services in buildings that had once echoed with accusations of witchcraft. Yet, beneath this veneer of industrial progress and moral propriety, certain truths were systematically buried, their records destroyed with methodical precision. What you are about to hear has been reconstructed from fragments preserved in private collections, family letters hidden in attics, and testimonies whispered in confidence long after the principal actors had vanished. The contrast between Salem's carefully maintained public image and its buried secrets reveals how a community can collectively choose blindness when confronted with unspeakable acts. This is not merely a story of individual evil, but of institutional complicity, of how those in power can erase inconvenient truths from official memory. The events that unfolded on Charter Street in the spring of 1894 were witnessed by dozens, investigated by authorities, and then deliberately expunged from all public records. Only through the persistence of those who refused to forget, who preserved scraps of evidence despite threats and pressure, can we now piece together what happened in that house 3 blocks from Salem Harbor. The sisters who arrived in Salem 7 years before the fire brought with them secrets that would transform their respectable boarding house into a chamber of horrors, and their exposure would test whether Salem valued truth or reputation more highly. The Smith sisters arrived in Salem during the summer of 1887, their appearance unremarkable, save for the fact that all 3 remained unmarried at ages that marked them as confirmed spinsters by Victorian standards. Constance, the eldest at 42, carried herself with the rigid posture of one accustomed to authority, her dark hair severely parted and pinned, her clothing impeccably modest yet well-tailored. Harriet, 3 years younger at 39, possessed a softer demeanor that would later endear her to Salem's charitable societies, though her pale blue eyes held a distant quality that some found unsettling. Patience, the youngest at 35, managed the practical affairs with quiet efficiency, her small hands surprisingly strong, her movements precise and economical. They claimed to have inherited substantial funds from their recently deceased father, Dr. Tobias Smith of Providence, Rhode Island, a physician of some reputation whose medical instruments and extensive library they brought with them in numerous crates. The house they purchased on Charter Street stood 3 stories tall, a colonial structure dating to the 1782s with clapboard siding, painted dove gray, and black shutters that gave it a respectable, if somewhat forbidding appearance. The property included a small carriage house and gardens that Patience would transform into neat beds of herbs and vegetables. Most notable was the attic, which spanned the entire 3rd floor and had been divided by previous owners into 6 separate chambers, accessed by a narrow staircase from the 2nd floor landing. The sisters paid in cash, causing some speculation among Salem's banking community, but their letters of introduction from Providence clergy and their immediate attendance at First Church quickly established their social credentials. Within weeks of their arrival, Constance had placed advertisements offering music instruction for young ladies, while Harriet presented herself at the Salem Female Charitable Society as a willing volunteer for their various good works among the city's deserving poor. The Smith sisters' integration into Salem society proceeded with calculated precision during their first 5 years of residence. Constance quickly established herself as a sought-after music teacher, her students drawn from the daughters of prosperous merchants and mill managers who appreciated her exacting standards and proper deportment. She conducted lessons in the front parlor where a fine Chickering piano held prominence, its polished surface reflecting the light from tall windows dressed in heavy burgundy drapes. Parents praised her ability to instill both musical proficiency and ladylike behavior in their daughters, though some noted she seemed to take particular interest in those students who mentioned troubles at home or difficult family circumstances. Harriet became indispensable at the Salem Female Charitable Society, organizing clothing drives for factory workers' families and visiting the sick with baskets of provisions. Her fellow volunteers admired her dedication, though they occasionally found her questions about the young women under the society's care oddly persistent, particularly regarding those without close family connections. Patients transformed their Charter Street property into a model of domestic efficiency, the gardens producing vegetables that she preserved for winter, the house maintained in spotless condition by her own hands, as the sisters initially employed no servants. Their church attendance never wavered, occupying the same pew each Sunday, their prayer books well worn, their voices joining the hymns with apparent devotion. In 1889, they announced their intention to take in lodgers, explaining that their large house seemed wasteful for just 3 occupants and that they wished to provide respectable accommodation for young working women of good character. The rector of First Church endorsed this charitable impulse from the pulpit, praising the sisters for opening their home to those who might otherwise fall prey to the dangerous boarding houses near the docks, where moral supervision was notoriously absent. The lodging arrangement that commenced in the spring of 1889 operated under rules that seemed designed to protect both the reputation of the house and the virtue of its occupants. Advertisements placed in newspapers from Portland to Providence sought refined young ladies of good character, requiring respectable accommodation while pursuing employment or education in Salem. The terms were clearly stated in correspondence that survives in family collections. Monthly rent of $12, including breakfast and dinner, laundry privileges, and use of the parlor in the evenings. Male visitors were strictly forbidden beyond the front hall, where they might leave calling cards but could advance no further. The 10 o'clock curfew was absolute, with the front door locked and bolted promptly, requiring any tardy lodger to ring and face Constance's disapproving scrutiny. Sunday church attendance at First Church was mandatory unless illness provided excuse, with the lodgers walking as a group behind the sisters like a line of ducklings. Meals were taken communally in the dining room, where Patience's simple but adequate cooking was served on good china, and conversation was expected to remain elevated and appropriate. The second floor contained 6 bedrooms for lodgers, each furnished with iron bedstead, washstand, wardrobe, and small writing desk. The third-floor attic remained strictly private, its door at the top of the narrow stairs always locked, explained as storage space and the sisters' personal quarters where they required absolute privacy. Among the early lodgers, Martha Prescott's letters to her family in New Hampshire provide valuable insight into daily life at the Smith House between 1890 and 1891. She described her room as clean and comfortable, the meals as plain but plentiful, and her fellow lodgers as agreeable companions mostly employed as shop girls, teachers, seamstresses, and supervisors at the cotton mills. She mentioned hearing odd sounds at night, footsteps, and what might have been furniture moving above her ceiling, but attributed these to the natural settling of an old house. The spring of 1892 brought Rebecca Marsh to the Smith sisters' door, a young woman whose tragic fate would eventually help expose the horrors concealed within that respectable facade. 21 years old, fresh-faced with auburn hair and an eager disposition, Rebecca had secured employment at the Namkiag Steam Cotton Company as a bookkeeper, a position of some responsibility that spoke well of her intelligence and education. Her initial letters home to Vermont painted a rosy picture of her new situation, praising the comfortable accommodations, the pleasant company of fellow lodgers, and the maternal care shown by the Smith sisters. She wrote enthusiastically of Salem's bustle, the proximity to Boston, and her hopes for advancement at the mill. By May, however, the tone of her correspondence began to shift subtly. She mentioned that Constance had taken a particular interest in her, inquiring frequently about her family connections, her health history, and whether anyone might visit her from Vermont. The questions seemed intrusive, but Rebecca dismissed them as mere curiosity. June's letters expressed growing unease as restrictions appeared to multiply around her specifically. She was discouraged from socializing with co-workers after hours, told that certain foods at dinner would help her maintain her strength for long work days, and found that, Patience now insisted on preparing special tea for her each evening that left her drowsy and confused. Her final letter, dated July 15th, spoke of plans to leave the Smith house, mentioning that she had felt unwell lately but suspected the environment rather than illness was to blame. She promised to write again once settled in new lodgings. No further communication from Rebecca ever reached her family. When worried letters arrived from Vermont, Constance Smith replied with regret that Miss Marsh had departed suddenly after an unfortunate disagreement, leaving no forwarding address, suggesting perhaps she had been embarrassed by her abrupt departure and would contact them when settled elsewhere. Between the summer of 1892 and spring of 1893, a disturbing pattern emerged that would only become visible in retrospect when families began comparing their experiences years later. Young women arrived at the Smith house with hope and determination, settled into the routine of work and communal living, maintained regular correspondence with distant families, then suddenly ceased all communication. When frantic relatives inquired, the sisters provided explanations that seemed plausible in isolation, but formed a suspicious pattern when examined collectively. Clara Vincent, a 23-year-old milliner from Maine, allegedly left to marry a traveling salesman she had never previously mentioned, with the sisters claiming ignorance of her new surname or destination. Esther Downing, who had taught at a Salem grammar school, supposedly accepted a position at a school in California and departed so hastily she left belongings behind which the sisters dutifully donated to charity. Margaret Cole, employed at a dress shop on Essex Street, was said to have suffered a nervous breakdown and returned to her family, though her family in Connecticut insisted she never arrived, and they had received no word from her. Sarah Abbott, at 19, the youngest lodger that year, reportedly left after stealing money from another lodger's room, a shocking breach of trust that the sisters claimed left them too distressed to pursue the matter legally. Each explanation seemed designed to discourage further inquiry, either through shame, geographical distance, or the suggestion that the young woman herself was at fault. The families, scattered across New England and lacking resources for investigation, had little recourse but to accept these explanations, despite their private doubts. The Salem authorities showed no interest in investigating the disappearances of young women who were neither local nor from prominent families, particularly when the respectable Smith sisters provided reasonable explanations for each departure. The arrival of Dr. William Chester in Salem during the autumn of 1893 introduced an observer whose medical training and professional ethics would not allow him to ignore troubling signs that others had dismissed or failed to notice. At 28, Chester had recently completed his medical studies in Boston and chosen Salem for his practice, partly due to family connections and partly because the growing industrial population promised steady need for a physician. Educated in the latest medical theories and practices, he approached his profession with the idealism of youth tempered by scientific rigor. When Constance Smith developed bronchitis in November, she reluctantly summoned him after her usual remedies proved insufficient. Chester found his patient to be a woman of sharp intelligence who questioned his prescribed treatments with knowledge that suggested medical familiarity beyond that of a typical layperson. During his second visit to check on her progress, he encountered an unexpected scene that aroused his professional concern. A young lodger named Hannah Price was being assisted down the stairs by patients, her gait unsteady and her eyes unfocused in a manner Chester immediately recognized. When he attempted to examine Miss Price, expressing concern about her evident sedation, Constance intervened sharply from her sickbed. She explained that Hannah suffered from severe hysteria and nervous exhaustion that required treatment with calming medicines according to methods their late father had perfected. Chester observed that Hannah's pupils were constricted to pinpoints, her speech slurred, and her responses delayed in ways consistent with excessive doses of morphine or laudanum. His suggestion that such treatment required proper medical supervision was met with cold dismissal. Constance informed him that the Smith family possessed extensive medical knowledge inherited from their father, a respected physician, and that they were quite capable of managing female complaints without interference. Chester departed deeply troubled, making notes in his personal journal about the inappropriate use of powerful sedatives and his professional obligation to report suspected medical malpractice. The fire that erupted in the Smith house during the early hours of March 17, 1894, would finally tear away the veil of respectability that had concealed years of horror. At approximately 2 in the morning, neighbors were awakened by the smell of smoke and the sight of flames visible through the kitchen windows of the Charter Street property. The alarm was raised quickly, with residents forming a bucket brigade, while runners summoned the Salem Fire Department. The Smith sisters emerged from the house in their nightclothes, Constance maintaining her composure even while apparently in distress, Harriet weeping dramatically, and Patience clutching a small valise as if it contained precious items. Neighbors wrapped them in blankets and offered comfort, while firefighters attacked the blaze that had spread from the kitchen through the first floor and was beginning to climb the walls toward the second story. The fire crew worked efficiently, their new steam pumper providing adequate water pressure to contain the flames before they could fully engulf the structure. Assistant Fire Chief Robert Gaines, a veteran of many fires, entered the building to assess whether flames had reached the upper floors through the walls or chimney. Following protocol, he climbed to the attic to check for hidden fire that could reignite after the main blaze was extinguished. What Gaines discovered in those attic chambers would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Witnesses reported seeing him emerge from the house after less than 5 minutes in the attic, his face drained of color, refusing to speak before dropping to his knees and vomiting repeatedly on the front lawn. Fire Chief Samuel Morton immediately entered to investigate what had so disturbed his experienced assistant. He remained inside for nearly 10 minutes before emerging with a grim expression, ordering all firefighting efforts to cease and the house to be immediately evacuated and sealed. His next command was to send for Sheriff James Thornhill with utmost urgency while posting firefighters as guards at every entrance. What authorities discovered in the pre-dawn hours of March 17th would have been unbelievable had not multiple witnesses observed and documented the scene before the systematic erasure began. The attic that the Smith sisters had declared private contained horrors that revealed the true purpose of their charitable boarding house. 5 of the 6 chambers showed clear evidence of prolonged human captivity, each containing a narrow iron bedstead with leather restraint straps attached to the frame, covered with stained mattresses that spoke of long use. The windows had been boarded over from the inside and painted black, preventing any light from entering or escaping. Crude ventilation holes had been drilled to provide minimal air circulation. The 6th chamber presented an even more disturbing sight, arranged as a makeshift medical facility, with an examination table fitted with stirrups and restraints, cabinets containing surgical instruments, and shelves lined with bottles of morphine, laudanum, chloroform, and other substances. Medical texts and journals were stacked on a desk, their margins filled with handwritten notes in a precise, feminine hand. Most horrifying was the discovery made when investigators noticed that one wall sounded hollow when tapped. Behind this false partition, they found the remains of at least 3 young women in various states of decomposition, wrapped in sheets and stacked like cordwood. The sheriff's initial report, portions of which survived despite later attempts at destruction, described the scene as suggesting systematic imprisonment, medical experimentation, and murder carried out over a period of years. The smell that permeated those chambers spoke of human misery, bodily waste, chemical preparations, and death combined in a miasma that sent hardened investigators fleeing for fresh air. Personal effects found in the chambers included items of clothing, hair ribbons, photographs, and pathetic attempts at recording messages scratched into the walls with fingernails or hidden beneath floorboards. The immediate aftermath of the attic discovery revealed both the Smith sisters' careful planning and the swift mobilization of Salem's power structure to contain potential scandal. During the initial chaos as authorities processed the scene, the 3 sisters were taken to the sheriff's office for questioning under guard. Constance maintained absolute silence, sitting erect in her chair and meeting all questions with an unwavering stare that unnerved even experienced interrogators. Harriet alternated between hysterical weeping and fainting spells that may have been genuine or calculated performances, rendering her incapable of providing coherent responses. Patience initially seemed the most likely to break, muttering fragments about their father's important work and the need to continue his research into female maladies, before Constance silenced her with a sharp look. By mid-morning, attorney Theodore Blackwell arrived from Boston, a man whose reputation for handling delicate matters for prominent families preceded him. His presence raised immediate questions about who had summoned him and who was paying his substantial fees. Blackwell insisted on private consultation with his clients and emerged, declaring that the sisters would make no statements without formal charges being filed. He then produced documents suggesting that an anonymous benefactor stood ready to post whatever bail might be required. Sheriff Thornhill faced pressure from multiple directions as word of the discoveries spread despite attempts to maintain secrecy. By noon on March 18th, after hushed conferences with city officials and mysterious telephone communications with Boston, the sisters were released on bail of $5,000 each, an extraordinary sum that was paid in cash by Blackwell. They were instructed not to leave Salem pending further investigation. That night, despite surveillance that was later claimed to have been maintained, the Smith sisters vanished completely. Their beds at the temporary lodging arranged by their attorney were found undisturbed, their few possessions abandoned, no witnesses to their departure despite the supposed watch. The machinery of official concealment ground into motion with remarkable efficiency in the days following the Smith sisters' disappearance. Mayor Charles Harrison convened an emergency meeting on March 19th that included select members of the city council, Sheriff Thornhill, police officials, prominent businessmen, and representatives from Salem's oldest families. Behind the closed doors of City Hall, arguments raged about the appropriate response to the horrifying discoveries at Charter Street. Those present later remained remarkably consistent in their silence about the specific discussions, but the outcome became clear through subsequent actions. Salem's reputation, already forever tainted by the witch trials of 1692, could not survive another scandal involving the systematic torture and murder of innocent women. The city's industrial prosperity depended on attracting workers and maintaining an image of safety and respectability. Several council members owned textile mills that employed young women who might flee if Salem became known as a place where female lodgers disappeared into houses of horror. The tourism industry, just beginning to capitalize on sanitized witch trial history, would be devastated by contemporary murders that made historical accusations pale in comparison. After hours of debate, the assembly reached consensus that the full truth must be suppressed for the greater good of the community. A carefully crafted official statement was prepared, acknowledging that fire at the Smith residence had revealed evidence of several deaths occurring over time, but attributing these to natural causes exacerbated by unsanitary conditions and inadequate medical care. The Smith sisters were characterized as misguided women who had fled in panic after realizing their negligence might be construed as criminal. No mention was made of restraints, medical experiments, or evidence of systematic imprisonment. The statement emphasized that no current danger existed, and that authorities were investigating to ensure proper burial of remains and notification of families where identification was possible. The systematic erasure of evidence began immediately after the official narrative was established. Sheriff Thornhill's detailed report documenting the crime scene was confiscated by the mayor's office within hours of its completion, with the sheriff ordered to produce a revised version conforming to the approved statement. Fire Chief Morton received similar instructions, with the original fire department logs describing the attic discoveries removed and replaced with bland accounts of structural damage and smoke inhalation risks. Individual firefighters who had witnessed the scene were visited by city officials, accompanied by prominent employers. Conversations that made clear their continued employment and family welfare depended on forgetting specific details. Some were transferred to different stations or encouraged to relocate entirely. Robert Gaines, whose violent reaction had been witnessed by dozens, was pensioned off early, with the understanding that his health had been compromised by smoke inhalation during years of service. Dr. William Chester received an unsigned letter suggesting that his recent observations at the Smith house had been misinterpreted due to his inexperience, and that pursuing unfounded allegations would certainly damage his nascent practice and reputation. When Chester persisted in raising concerns, he found his hospital privileges under review and wealthy patients canceling appointments. The message was clear and eventually heeded. Physical evidence from the house was removed under cover of darkness, with city workers supervised by trusted officials loading carts with documentation, medical equipment, and human remains. Where these materials were taken remains unknown, though rumors persisted of nighttime burials in unmarked sections of cemeteries and bonfires in isolated locations. The house itself was condemned as structurally unsound due to fire damage. despite engineers privately acknowledging it could have been repaired. Within 6 months, the property was demolished, the cellar filled, and the land cleared. By year's end, even the address had been officially changed, erasing Charter Street's connection to the events. Despite the official suppression, scattered voices refused to be entirely silenced, preserving fragments of truth in private letters, diary entries, and whispered conversations that would surface decades later. Elizabeth Marsh, younger sister of the vanished Rebecca, embarked on a determined quest to discover her sister's fate that would consume 20 years of her life. Her carefully preserved correspondence reveals a network of families across New England who had lost daughters at the Smith house, women who shared information despite official discouragement and sometimes outright threats. These letters speak of frustrating encounters with Salem authorities who claimed no records existed of their daughters ever residing in the city, of lodger registries supposedly destroyed in the fire, of death certificates that could not be located. Martha Coleman wrote from Connecticut in 1895, describing how Salem police had refused to investigate her daughter Margaret's disappearance, suggesting she had likely run off with a man and brought shame on herself. Agnes Vincent in Maine reported being told that pursuing inquiries about her daughter Clara would only damage the missing woman's reputation and accomplish nothing positive. Fire Chief Morton, tormented by what he had witnessed and his forced complicity in the cover-up, began keeping a private journal that he concealed from his family. Written in a cramped hand and hidden in his workshop, these pages documented his memories of that night before they could fade or be altered by repetition of official lies. He described the positioning of bodies behind the false wall, the medical equipment arranged with scientific precision, the personal effects that humanized the victims, and, crucially, a leather-bound journal he had glimpsed on the desk that appeared to contain detailed records in feminine handwriting. Dr. Chester maintained his own medical notes about the inappropriate sedation he had witnessed, adding observations about patterns of missing young women who had been his patients before vanishing from Salem. The decades following 1894 witnessed Salem's transformation into a modern city that seemed to have successfully buried its latest dark secret beneath prosperity and progress. The generation that had direct knowledge of events aged and died, taking memories with them that younger residents had no reason to question or investigate. Salem's industrial growth continued. Its port remained busy. Tourists came to visit sanitized witch trial attractions, and the empty lot where the Smith house had stood was eventually forgotten as just another undeveloped parcel in a city with many vacant spaces. Occasional mentions surfaced in regional newspapers when persistent families attempted to revive investigations, but these were dismissed as confusion with other cases or simple refusal to accept that young women sometimes disappeared by choice. In 1919, Elizabeth Marsh petitioned the Massachusetts Attorney General to examine Salem's handling of multiple disappearances in the 1,890 seconds, providing documentation she had gathered from 7 families. The petition was denied for lack of evidence, and the suggestion made that Miss Marsh might benefit from less morbid pursuits. A similar attempt in 1927 by a consortium of families met the same fate, with additional warnings about potential libel suits if unsubstantiated accusations continued. By 1933, when the last organized attempt was made, most original family members had died, and their children saw little point in pursuing answers to questions that had brought only frustration. The Smith sisters entered folklore stripped of specific details, becoming the mad women in the attic, or the cannibal sisters, or simply those women who did something terrible long ago. The true horror of systematic imprisonment, medical experimentation, and murder was reduced to ghost stories told by children who had no knowledge of the real events. The empty lot on Charter Street remained curiously undeveloped, with multiple attempts at construction failing due to funding issues, permit problems, or workers refusing to continue after reporting uneasy feelings and strange discoveries in the ground. In 1957, Margaret Flynn entered the graduate program in American history at Boston University, with interests in industrialization, gender, and social reform in 19th-century New England. Her discovery of the Smith sisters case began accidentally while researching Salem's textile industry for a seminar paper on female factory workers' living conditions. Examining financial records at the Essex County Courthouse, she noticed unusual payments from something called the Salem Civic Fund to families in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut during 1894 and 1895. The amounts were substantial, ranging from $500 to $2,000, listed simply as settlements with no explanation of what was being settled. Her curiosity aroused, Flynn traced the recipient names and discovered that many appeared in newspaper archives making inquiries about missing daughters in Salem during the early 1890 seconds. This connection led her to Salem's own newspapers from that period, where she found the carefully worded announcement about the fire at a Charter Street boarding house and subsequent departure of its proprietors. The bland official statement contrasted sharply with payments suggesting compensation, or perhaps hush money, to prevent further investigation. Flynn's thesis advisor initially encouraged her research as an interesting example of municipal corruption, but his attitude changed when she reported finding evidence of a massive cover-up involving multiple murders. Professor Harrison suggested she was making unfounded leaps from financial irregularities to criminal conspiracy, that such accusations against Salem's historical authorities would be professionally damaging without absolute proof, and that her dissertation should focus on more established historical narratives. Flynn persisted despite academic pressure, spending weekends traveling to small-town historical societies and libraries across New England. In Vermont, she made her most significant discovery when the curator of the Brattleboro Historical Society mentioned they had boxes of uncatalogued personal papers, including something about a Salem mystery that might interest her. The construction project that would finally unearth physical evidence began in spring 1959, when Salem announced plans for a new municipal building on Charter Street, requiring deep excavation for modern foundations and parking. Despite protests from the Historical Society about disturbing a colonial-era site, city planners insisted no significant structures remained, and proceeded with demolition of existing buildings. When workers began excavating, they encountered unexpected resistance in the form of an old foundation much more extensive than surface examination had suggested. The construction foreman reported finding evidence of a large cellar that appeared to have been deliberately filled with rubble and sealed. City officials ordered work to continue despite growing unease among the construction crew, who reported strange odors and unsettling discoveries. On April 12th, the excavator bucket broke through into a sealed chamber that had been missed during the original demolition, probably because it extended beyond the house's main foundation into what had been garden space. Work immediately halted, as the operator reported seeing wooden crates and what appeared to be laboratory equipment through the hole. The site supervisor contacted city authorities, who arrived within minutes, attempting to cordon off the area and resume work. However, several workers had already descended into the space and emerged with artifacts that would prove impossible to suppress. Photographs taken by a quick-thinking laborer before officials could confiscate cameras showed shelves of medical instruments, dozens of glass containers with preserved specimens, and stacks of journals wrapped in oilcloth. Most damning were the 7 sets of human remains discovered beneath the cellar floor, laid out with scientific precision and showing clear evidence of surgical intervention. The medical examiner's preliminary field report, leaked to the press before it could be suppressed, described evidence of experimental surgeries, prolonged restraint, and systematic abuse that he characterized as medical torture under the guise of research into female hysteria. The journals recovered from the sealed cellar provided horrifying insight into the Smith sisters' motivations and methods, revealing a legacy of madness passed from father to daughters. Written primarily in Constance's precise handwriting with occasional entries by her sisters, these documents detailed 6 years of systematic imprisonment, experimentation, and murder presented as scientific research. The entries began in 1889 with discussions of their father, Dr. Tobias Smith's theories about female hysteria, nervous disorders, and the biological inferiority of women that required correction through medical intervention. Tobias had lost his medical license in Providence in 1881 after several female patients died under suspicious circumstances during treatments for nervous conditions. Rather than accepting his disgrace, he had trained his daughters in his methods, convincing them they were continuing important scientific work that narrow-minded medical establishments refused to recognize. The journals revealed that the sisters specifically targeted young women without strong family connections, those whose disappearances would cause minimal investigation. They recorded detailed observations of each victim's response to various treatments, including forced sedation, surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia, prolonged restraint in darkened chambers, and administration of experimental drug combinations. Each woman was assigned a number, and their reactions meticulously documented as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings. Constance wrote with chilling detachment about testing the limits of human endurance, investigating whether hysteria could be cured through physical modification, and attempting to prove their father's theories about female anatomy requiring correction. The journals also contained financial records showing that the sisters had inherited substantial wealth from their father, allowing them to maintain their house, pay bribes when necessary, and present themselves as charitable women while using their resources to fund their hideous experiments. The public revelation of evidence from Charter Street in 1959 forced Salem authorities to acknowledge what they had suppressed for 65 years, though they attempted to minimize municipal complicity. The Massachusetts Attorney General launched an investigation that revealed the extent of the cover-up, while carefully avoiding implication of still powerful Salem families whose ancestors had participated. Margaret Flynn published her groundbreaking article in the New England Quarterly, documenting not just the crimes, but the systematic erasure of evidence and silencing of families seeking justice. The piece sparked national attention and demands for full disclosure that Salem officials could no longer resist. Attempts to locate the Smith sisters or their descendants proved fruitless, as they had vanished completely after fleeing Salem in 1894. Some evidence suggested they had assistance from sympathetic parties in Boston society, possibly other followers of their father's theories who helped them escape to Canada or Europe. Records were checked in major cities across the United States, and inquiries made through international channels, but the sisters had successfully erased themselves from history as thoroughly as Salem had tried to erase their crimes. Families of victims finally received acknowledgement of their losses, though no real justice or compensation beyond the bribes paid in the 1,890 seconds. The remains discovered in the cellar were subjected to modern forensic analysis that confirmed the medical examiner's initial assessment of surgical experimentation and systematic abuse. DNA testing was not yet available, but dental records and personal effects allowed identification of several victims whose families had preserved missing person reports. Salem struggled with how to memorialize the victims without creating a tourist attraction that would overshadow their carefully cultivated witch trial narrative, eventually installing a simple plaque that mentioned young women who died without specifying the horrific circumstances. The legacy of the Smith sisters' case extends beyond the individual tragedies to illustrate how institutions protect themselves at the expense of truth and justice for the powerless. Salem's officials in 1894 made calculated decisions that preserving the city's reputation and economic interests outweighed the rights of murdered young women and their grieving families to acknowledgement and justice. The complicity extended throughout the community, as neighbors who had observed troubling signs chose not to intervene. Authorities who should have investigated chose to accept convenient explanations, and citizens who knew fragments of truth chose silence over difficult questions. The successful suppression for over 6 decades demonstrates how effectively powerful interests can rewrite history when they control official records, intimidate witnesses, and deny platforms to those seeking answers. Only through the persistence of individuals like Elizabeth Marsh, who refused to accept lies about her sister, officials like Fire Chief Morton, who preserved truth in secret writings, and researchers like Margaret Flynn, who followed financial anomalies to their dark source, did fragments of reality survive. The empty lot on Charter Street that resisted development for decades perhaps reflected some collective unconscious memory of what had occurred there, a psychic scar on the landscape that prevented normal use until time had sufficiently distanced the horror. Modern Salem incorporated the case into its complex relationship with dark history, neither fully acknowledging nor completely denying what had occurred. The municipal parking garage, finally built on the site in 1985, is reportedly plagued by high employee turnover, with workers complaining of unexplained sounds, cold spots, and overwhelming feelings of dread in certain areas. Security cameras occasionally malfunction in ways that suggest figures moving where no one should be. These reports are dismissed as imagination or mechanical failure, but those who work late shifts often refuse to enter certain sections alone. Perhaps some truths refuse to stay buried regardless of official efforts at erasure. The Smith sisters may have escaped earthly justice, but the young women they tortured and murdered achieved a different form of vindication, as their stories finally emerged from the darkness of that terrible attic to stand in evidence against those who would deny their suffering.